John Dewey founded the Chautauqua Children's School. And so it's a piece of our history here that is incredibly important in the sense of that. Although I have to tell you that I thought maybe to just like popularize this a bit, I Googled, or no, not Google, Wikipedia, whatever that verb is, John Dewey, and it said, a little-known philosopher, well, I formed a laboratory school at the University of Chicago where he was an associate professor of pedagogy, I think, or maybe it was in philosophy, hired by William Rainey Harper, the original president of the university. University of Chicago was founded with Rockefeller money in order to assuage his terrible guilt about what he had done. I understand, but I don't know. If somebody were to have come to Chautauqua, let's say in 1875, and looked at the education of young children here, what is it likely that they would have seen?
Well, first of all, I must tell you that with this assignment, I went to the archives and talked to John Schmidt. I should have talked to Joan, well, I think I talked to Joan at the same time. But actually, in reality, there's very little in the archives about those very early days. Clearly, Chautauqua was started as a Sunday school training facility. Joan has documentation that in 1875, there were 300 children a day in Tent C. Now, your imagination with Tent C and mine are probably identical. I think it was pretty chaotic. They wouldn't have had any equipment. They'd have been on the ground. They'd have been playing, and there would have been adults there that would have been trying to focus the children. Now, there's no documentation that says that these were young children. This was children. So I would sort of guess that was pretty much all the children in Chautauqua were forced into Tent C, and they
while their parents were out
doing
Sunday
other
school
things, right?
Teachers, yeah.
And so, if you think of that time, it probably would have the activities would have related a little bit like what probably some of us experienced as Vacation Bible School. So there would have been some games. There would have been. Chautauqua was this wonderful place in the woods, so they couldn't have corralled them all in there for the length of time that they were there. So it is very interesting, and I put in the little timeline, which basically is thanks to Joan. By 1878, Lewis Miller had donated the Children's Temple. The Children's Temple was on the across from the library on Bester Plaza. Now, there's no real indication, I don't think you have photographs of, whether there were benches and chairs or what that facility looked like. It's very interesting, though, in the research that I did, I came across a dissertation done by John Malcolm in 1972, and in that was a quote, and I'm just going to sort of paraphrase. There was a quote from Lewis Miller to a good friend in 1872 at a Canton, Ohio Sunday school camp meeting. And basically, Lewis Miller said, most Sunday school teachers were also teachers in secular schools. And what a great idea to get these teachers together, have a 2 or 3 week camp meeting, give them some inspiration for teaching, get them rested and relaxed, and be ready for Sunday school and for regular school in the fall. I thought that was just an amazing quote. It was by Jane Bush.
Book.
Jane Book. Kate Book.
Kate Brook. We'll get it. Kate Brook.
Whose sister was married to Lewis Miller's brother. So this sister, the two of these women, Joan knows, came to Chautauqua in 1872. They were so enthralled with this Fairpoint that in that year they bought lot number 16, which is the Lewis Miller Cottage. So, but to me, it demonstrated that from the get-go, adult education and the children's program were all together. There was no real separation. They were looking at a model of teacher training. They were looking at establishing a curriculum and ideas for Sunday school.
Now, those same teachers who were going back in the fall, what did their schools look like from,
Well,
for the next?
they would have looked like, when you asked the question about memory from school, they would have looked just like the school I attended, which was after the war. It was a reopened one-room schoolhouse. All the desks were screwed down, and there was a big furnace in the middle where the teacher had to fire the furnace. I mean, that's what they would have looked like in the 1870s. And the methodology would have been recitation and memorization and probably not adequate books. Probably it would have been pretty rigid. The exact thing that Dewey was reacting to, the extreme rigidity. It's also interesting to note that I think what somewhat influenced the school movement and the Sunday school and the adult ed was really the Methodists. Methodists really didn't particularly separate secular from religious. And because of that, my first question was, how, in thinking about this assignment, was how do you separate religious Sunday school? When did it switch from being a Sunday school training or Sunday school type atmosphere to the 1921 sort of model nursery school?
Mm-hmm.
There's really no documentation of how that happened. But I think when you think about the Methodist roots of this institution, you think of people who did not separate the secular from the religious. They felt education was critical, and they wanted to see people go back and create a better community. And I think that was just real basic. Also, another, just from reviewing Jeff Simpson's Chautauqua book, if you've read his history, Jeff happens to be a friend of ours, and I was struck by the notation that he makes early in that book that Chautauqua was really the national podium from 1874 to 1925, where ideas were really discussed. Chautauqua was well known, and it was really sort of in the forefront of progressive movements and the whole.
Not just education.
Not just education, but all
women's education.
All of that. And so when you look at the history of the nursery school, and if you look at the timeline, and you you think of the other things that were happening at the same time, Froebel and the kindergarten movement, which was primarily a Midwestern movement. You look at the theorists and the people that were working out of Chicago, the whole nursery school movement was very closely tied to home economics. And if you know anything about the history of Chautauqua, domestic science and home economics was critical here. Cornell had an early presence here with extension services, and it was all really very tied together.
Well, Alan just spoke about the Children's Temple, and the Children's Temple was given by Lewis Miller. It was his gift, that building. And then we had all of these locations for education. It was just overwhelming. They were all over the ground. But before I go into those, I want to speak about Frank Beard. This is Frank Beard over here. And he was critical to the Children's Temple. He really was the program. He's the chalk talker. And he was the first chalk talker. He was on the Lyceum circuit for 25 years. And we were lucky enough to get him at Chautauqua the very first year. And he and Vincent were like this. They were very good buddies. He passed away in 1905. 1905. He came from this huge, talented family of artists. Everybody in the family seemed to be an artist, and he also, his sisters and his brothers were the founders of the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. So they had lots of skills going for them. Beard was a cartoonist as well as a chalk talker and an illustrator. He was an inventive leader. He was fearless defender of justice. And in his cartoons, which I have over there, you'll see that he cartooned every sort of political event that was around. It's quoted when he spoke, "He presents the fundamental truth appertaining to human well-being in the simplest form, and yet so vividly that deep impressions are made on all hearts through his chalk and his humor." He had lots of humor. And Beard felt that every student must participate in their own learning. So he was the inspiration and the designer for the Chautauqua desk. And I have a salesman's model over there. It's a smaller model. But the Chautauqua desk is the original laptop.
An acoustic laptop.
Yes, only it's manual. You turn the scroll, right?
Were they marketed around the country, or you say it's a salesman's model?
That's a salesman's model. They were never sold to schools. It was a parent-child thing. They sold 2 million before they went belly up in the Depression. And they made many, many improvements. But I have this huge connection to this wonderful Frank Beard because he is the inspiration for the desk, and my family, it was manufactured, it was inspired here, but manufactured in Valparaiso, Indiana, outside of Chicago. My whole mother's family was involved in the desk, and I was inspired to write a book about it, which is over there, a booklet, let's put it that way. And it's been said that Frank Beard's legacy to the American life is the Chautauqua desk. Now, back to...
I'd like to add that in my research, Vincent was so excited those first years about Frank Beard that he decided every Sunday school that he had any contact had to have a chalkboard. So before this desk came out, they were trying to get chalkboards in church Sunday schools all over the country.
One of Frank Beard's talents, he figured out you didn't have to have a slate. You could take a board and paint it, so you didn't have to carry around this heavy slate. That was one of the things he figured out. But he also did the minutes for the Children's Temple, and they were really amazing. He did all the illustrations on them. And one of the things that came out of some of this was the Chautauqua architectural blocks. And they're over there on the table. And these were given to Frank Lloyd Wright by his mother when he was 2 or 3 years old. So there you go. Success was his. So those are the architectural blocks.
Very developmentally appropriate.
They had teachers' classes in the museum, which is now gone, by 1886, and Mrs. Jewett had her house for their residence. So that still is used for a staff residence, but at that time it was for teachers only. Mrs. B.T. Vinson, who was the bishop's sister-in-law, she conducted the Little People's class in 1896 in Kellogg Hall. And that's also where the Chicago Institute people were, and that was a very, very big program. Then we had John Dewey coming along about that time. But then over on the Overlook, we had some action. Henrietta Orr Jones, who's the founder of the Bird and Tree Club, she had a Montessori kindergarten. All of you know she has that Italian loggia house, and on the side is where she had the kindergarten. She had that maybe 6 or 7 years. Now, all this took place before private nursery schools were even around. They didn't come around until 1918, and of course, it was much earlier than Early Push or Head Start. Now, one of the most interesting things was that I found there was a school of mothercraft. In 1914, it was at 4 Heading. Now, Heading isn't where it is today. Heading is Vincent, up the hill. So that house that's on the corner of Vincent and Terrace was the Mothercraft house. And she not only had babysitting there and table boarders, but she did college studies as well. Then in the 1950s, the New York University people came and they offered accredited programs in practice teaching and courses. It was very extensive and a big connection to Chicago. They formed one of the first parent institutes. Now, I bet you didn't know that the very first PTA was founded here by our mothers in all these little programs. And that was founded in 1895. And the National Teachers Association, which is now NEA, had a major big conference here in 1880. So that is really, really early.
I have just one question. You said in 1914, when Henrietta Orr Jones had the kindergarten, it was a Montessori kindergarten? Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I just want to read you a little excerpt. I don't know if it was the Chautauqua Assembly Herald or the Daily, but a reporter went over to the kindergarten to see what they were doing. So the reporter called at Kellogg Hall yesterday morning, just as the wee kindergartners were taking to their recreation. Such a jolly time as they have, especially during the wet weather. The course this season is interdependence, and the instruction is given from the point of view of home and nature. And then he describes their marching around and singing and having, this good time. But he notices this one little girl who, in my estimation, was way ahead of her time. One tiny tot, who I suppose to be a boy, because of her boy clothes and her short hair, was inexpressibly cute. She was always dressed as a boy so that she may have greater freedom of movement and enjoy her play to the utmost. Now, later in the article, he talks about their field trip from Kellogg over to Terrace to see the shoemaker. Now, the shoemaker was the Bogine family, and that was the building right next to the Chautauqua Inn, which they owned. So that's where they went for their field trip. So now we're up to where the children's school
What year was
started,
that? What you just described?
1896, pretty early. So we'll stop there because the children's schools was built in 1821. Oh, 1921, 1921.
And neither Joan or I worked there then.
Listen, today's 90s is the new 30s. So Joan, describe the children's school that you knew. What went on
Great
there?
place.
I know that.
Give us your years, Joan. What years?
I was there in the 60s and 70s, which seems like yesterday, though it was a long time ago. So it was built in 1921, and the purpose of the school had 3 purposes: work, play, and study. Now, the Percy Gerwig pergola that you see up there, that originally was down where Holbrook Church is. And that was a huge sandbox. And you brought your child over there, pinned a note on their back and left them in the sandbox for the day. So, just dropped them off. Originally, the building had just 2 sections and was open in the middle. And later they enclosed that because they needed more space, of course. In '46, they added the smaller porch. They added a back room in 1969. I got a large porch added during the very rainy season in 1974. And then all of you know about the recent renovations. Nancy Miller-Arn was my assistant for many, many years. And Nancy and I added pre-club. And the parents were extremely delighted because we didn't have the break, like we felt that the children were too tired to have that lunch break and then come back. So they brought their lunch and they stayed till 2 o'clock. And it was a great thing for everybody. We also added a babysitting course where we had the sheriff come. We added first aid courses for teachers. And then when I realized that New York University had been here as an accredited institution, I said, well, we should do that too. So we added a practicum and an independent study with the University of Pittsburgh. And then the next step was from that to add a parent council. And we had a really strong parent council going. It was really a wonderful thing. Then when I saw that Boys and Girls Club had a song and had colors, I said, well, why don't we have those? So our colors were black and blue. And our song is my only composition. We will be singing it later. It's my only musical composition. Then, to satisfy the safety for the children and the parents' needs for that safety, we color-coded the rooms. We had everybody come early and paint. So we had the red room, the blue room, and all of those rooms. Then we created the badge, which of course was black and blue. And the color of the child was in there, so you knew if they got in the wrong room. Then I was appalled to see that nobody was on the bus with them beside the bus driver. So I invented the luggage tags on the back, because if you put them on the front, the kid takes them. So we had the luggage tags on the back, which are still being used. Yes?
I was hired by Joan. I worked there in '69.
And he was a doctoral student.
I worked there in '69 and in '70, 40 years ago.
What
Yes, I
color
was.
room were you in?
I was purple. I was assistant teacher to Florence Gardner. So many of you know Florence. In the last few years, she was a reading teacher,
specialist.
reading specialist, and she worked. You could sign up for Florence's reading courses. I got hired. Thankfully, I was a doctoral student in early childhood, and I had never worked in any group setting with young children. And in Western Pennsylvania, where I grew up and was studying, they wouldn't hire you in the public schools to work below third grade or below. Men couldn't be hired. So there really wasn't an opportunity to professionally work with children. When I would distinguish between play, which we might call free play, and play, which are the choices within the classroom, and in a high-quality child care program or nursery school, you should have 5 different choices. So that's the environment in which is set up by the teachers that you move to.
Yeah.
Housekeeping, to block play, to...
You have different centers.
And the different centers, so the children choose those centers and operate from there. Then you have what's called either outdoor or indoor total free play, which would be slightly different. But it's also a critical part of the day. And the children's school was really set up that way. I mean, it was University of Pittsburgh has a very, very strong play commitment. We're talking about based on the work of Anna Freud Eric Erikson, these theorists that really followed Dewey, but have a very strong connection with that movement. I think the typical nursery school is so, and continues to be so, committed to that because it's developmentally appropriate. You can't literally force large groups of children to do some of the things that we can make them do in first grade, second grade, whether they should be doing it or not. You really can't do that with groups of young.
Well, so compare your experiences with the Chautauqua Children's School and what you see in nursery schools, so-called nursery schools today. How is that different?
Well, the big problem today, the universal problem, is the push-down curriculum, which I refer to as more the merrier, sooner the better, that syndrome. Now, certainly you have precocious children. You know, 1 in 400 or something is reading at age 4, you know, but with a good child development approach, you can accommodate those children very easily in this more open classroom, which was the thesis of the progressive movement, an open classroom allowing children to make continuous progress, you don't hold anyone back. You know, that's really the core of a good preschool.
But the advantage of the children's school, you not only have very bright children, you have summer, they can be outdoors, you have the symphony to come, and you have the play and the theater, you have all of those people to come visit the school. You can go to the parking lot and study the license plates, the color, where is it from, what do those numbers say, you know, all of those things. We used to go to the practice shacks with our graham crackers and say, trick or treat, would you play your instrument for me? The thing that was, I think, the most wonderful year was one of the first years when we created the oldest group. They went and visited every major building at Chautauqua, if it wasn't too far away, and came back and made the building out of cardboard and what have you. And the whole room was filled with Chautauqua buildings. It was really terrific. So the opportunity here is...
That's a project approach.
And we don't care what the building looked like, it was the process, right? And the opportunity here is unmatched. You couldn't find it anywhere else.
Majority of your students were there most of the summer, John?
Yes, and that's the big change.
Free education, I can give it to you if I could remember it.
But this was Catholic? Do I remember that right?
It was some of everything.
Some of everything, all right. And some Canada, some United States, all right.
What they do, kick you out, Florence?
Yeah, she couldn't.
Yeah.
No, I wasn't really a discipline problem.
I've got the children's school enthusiasm down in my heart, up in my head, down in my toes. I've got the children's school enthusiasm all over me. I'm coming back next year, you bet. School enthusiasm down in my heart, up in my head, down in my toes. I got the chocolate school enthusiasm all over me. I'm